Hi, my name is Ashlie Scott, Assistant Curator here at the Colorado Railroad Museum. Today, for Small Wonders, we're going to be talking about advertising during World War II. Traveling by train was still the primary choice for long-distance travelers during the late 1930s into the 1940s. Patrons could choose various options, from riding in coach to open sections and sleeping cars, even private rooms. Those who were able purchased the most elegant accommodations with more amenities. It was a time when railroad companies were actively promoting destination traveling and new experiences. Train travel was at its height, and advertising reflected this. The focus on travel started to shift as nations around the world began to increase their war preparations. Knowing that war was likely inevitable, President Franklin D. Roosevelt was monitoring America's railroads to ensure their readiness. It wasn't until December 7, 1941, when Pearl Harbor was attacked, that President Roosevelt began enacting changes to the nation's rail transportation system. Unnecessary travel was now prohibited. Passengers were discouraged from taking pleasure excursions or holidays. Roosevelt appointed Ralph Budd as a federal transportation commissioner. Budd made it clear that if railroads were to remain privately owned and controlled, they would aid in the war efforts just like they did during World War I. Given the gravity of the situation following Pearl Harbor, Budd and all fellow rail companies were ready. With trains being used to transport fuel, supplies, and troops all across the country, changes to the railroad's promotional messaging began not long after. Advertising took on more of a propaganda view because of the war. "Keep 'em rolling, keep 'em going" was the main expression for Union Pacific, which along with many other companies, advertised the needs of railroads during the war. Unfortunately, not everyone connected the emergency to the ongoing challenges for would-be travelers. Civilians were told that they needed advanced reservations to travel, but these reservations weren't always guaranteed. This agitated many, leading to political cartoons, which mocked the delay and cancellations of trips and highlighted the few lucky ones who were able to grab a single ticket, even though they had a big family traveling with them. Railroads began posting different ads, thanking the public for their patience during this difficult time. They wanted travelers to remember the nation's troops were out there fighting on the front lines, and those troops needed supplies to get to them first. The Burlington route published various wartime ads on their timetables, with one of them being a nice reminder to all would-be riders on what to expect during the wartime emergency. Travel during midweek, thus avoiding weekend travel peaks. Get tickets well in advance and accept accommodations available. If plans change, cancel reservations immediately. Travel light. Check baggage not required en route. And in planning trips, allow for possible delays. War traffic has a right of way. Although pushback lasted the duration of the war, most Americans understood and found other ways to get around the nation. Buses were put in the spotlight for short-distance domestic travel, since they often fed into or even paralleled major routes. The Santa Fe Railroad had its own bus timetables that included messages for using buses during the war. In one of its timetables, the company mentioned bus service, essential in war and peace. It wasn't always a smooth trip via the bus lines. The government had local and inner-city lines reduce stops for fuel conservation, as well as ensuring priority seating was available for any man or woman in the service. Carpooling was pushed onto many individuals as well. Saving fuel, using rubber scraps, and maintaining all vehicles from cars to buses was emphasized in all the signage you might see on your travels. Despite the fact that advertising at the time included propaganda messaging in support of the war, many of the advertisements were still meant to help the public enjoy life while supporting war efforts. The railroads made sure of that. Honing in on the need for victory, posters and handouts alike shared stirring visions of soldiers coming home following victory or getting support while they were on the front lines. V for Victory was the focus as the war continued on from 1942 through 1945. Companies wanted to channel the American spirit and let all Americans know that their help with the war efforts not only supported the nation's troops, but would lead to winning the war. The use of colors was important for promotions, from small advertisements to billboard-sized posters on buildings. It's no surprise that the use of reds, whites, and blues emphasized the American spirit, no matter which ad was displayed. During this time, railroads continued to produce menus, leaflets, and other handouts for their trains and depots. Fred Harvey's Harvey Houses were one of many companies that designed its Harvey House and train menus to reflect the support for the war. For victory, buy war bonds was a common phrase used in Fred Harvey promotions throughout World War II. Because its host railroad, the Atchison, Topeka, and Santa Fe, operated several of America's busiest railroad routes serving the Pacific Front during the war, Harvey also shifted the all-important way that its Harvey houses were intended to work. Instead of serving the public as they had throughout their previous existence, service was changed to accommodate the high volume of troops stopping at these legendary restaurants. This was yet another frustration that many Santa Fe patrons had to overcome. But with the rail lines thanking all individuals for adapting to temporary changes, many travelers agreed the hardships were worth it. Although not preferable, these customers could support not having a full service and experience on the rails in support of the wartime emergency. Opening up a magazine or newspaper during these years, you would see the daily news and ads about how America's soldiers were working hard and had faith their country was behind them. All the positive messages and some that had extreme caricatures representing the Axis nations were made to invoke a fighting spirit in the hearts of Americans. This included raising funds in support of the war and organizing drives for clothing and food. Not only did these efforts provide more resources in support of troops, but some of these drives also helped support war-torn countries that needed the extra help in the midst of battle. As the war continued, railroads realized they needed extra hands to keep their trains rolling. They responded by creating promotions aimed at increasing their workforce. With all the teens and men enlisting in the military, the job openings left behind grew more urgent to fill every day. Another shift in advertising was seen as women stepped up and filled many of the roles left behind. "Do the job he left behind," or "women at work," became common phrases. In 1941, 13 million women were employed in the American workforce. By 1944, that number had increased to 20 million. 250,000 women were working on American railroads. Though much of World War II propaganda reflected white women stepping up, 600,000 black women served their nation as well, both in the armed forces and in civilian jobs, the railroad included, during the war. In 1945, World War II ended officially with the surrender of Japan. Germany had surrendered just a few months earlier as well. Promotions were altered once again, with a healthy dose of propaganda included, to celebrate the United States' war efforts, with the end of hostilities coming as a relief for most Americans. Railroad advertising and promotions once again focused on travel, honing in on growing families and the rise of the American suburban middle class as the years marched on. The GI Bill allowed veterans to purchase property and cars with greatly reduced interest rates, in turn allowing for more individuals and families to move across the country. At first, most did so by rail, but by the 1950s, the dawning of the interstate highway network and the development of the jet airplane would portend major changes. Advertising through World War II showed us the importance of how grasping one's attention can produce change. From conserving fuel to encouraging women to join the workforce, posters, timetables, menus, and railroad paraphernalia allowed the United States to foster a sense of community during a time of extreme duress. The many promotions, posters, and other objects and artifacts in the museum's collection from this period help tell the story of what life was like during the war and how this diverse country came together for the greater good. Thank you for tuning into this episode of Small Wonders. We'll see you next time.
Like, comment, share, and subscribe. Commenting and sharing in particular may qualify as virtual engagements for important funding programs like the SCFD.